Well, firstly, I'd like to thank Chikwe, IK, and Patty for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. It's something that brings back memories of the event that she just referred to 6 years ago, TED Global 2007. That event, in many ways, could be described as what I like to call a society of problem solvers. People who, in many ways, when you bring them together, they look at challenges, they look at things that need to be done, and get about fixing them. The ripple effect that this conference is themed on, in many ways, is something that we can speak to. It's something we can speak to as far as why we're here today, not necessarily because we had TED Global in 2007, but because of those whose shoulders we leaned on that came before us. The individuals that you're going to be looking at are some of those people that I would speak to. The first one, who isn't in the picture, but this is a picture of his community in Benin, was a Reverend Father from Nigeria who founded something called the Songhai Institute. The Songhai Institute has been around for over 20-something years, and it has built the kind of community, the kind of problem-solving community that we think we don't have enough of, and he's been around for this long. This other individual is a very well-known architect by the name of Dimas Nwoko. Some people actually say he may be one of the most preeminent architects in terms of his approach to design. He's been around since the 70s. Moving it forward a bit, Eleni Gabrimadin, she was an economist who in the early 2000s asked questions about what is it about our rural producers of food that we weren't doing enough for? How could we sort of even the table and make them individuals that had a bigger piece of the pie? She and a person by the name of Ella Natsui, I don't know how many of you are familiar with him. He's a Ghanaian artist who's been around since the 70s or maybe the 80s, who could be described as one of the preeminent artists of our time, one of those points of light that the world at large is seeing as important from a global standpoint. I want to use the word points of light because when I was given the task of putting together TED Global 2007, up until that point, based on my work and my interests, I had seen these points of light, not just within the continent, but within the diaspora. And what we ended up doing, and I say we because it wasn't just me, it was those who came as speakers, some of those who were here as fellows, was bring together a way of thinking that in other parts of the world are generally seen as the default way of doing things, but not necessarily associated with the continent we're from. And in many ways, that was critical. That was the event itself. There are a number of us here in the audience who were there. In many ways, the coming together was one of, whether you were an artist, a person who had an interest in African cuisine, a writer, a financier, an entrepreneur, a business person, you shared this sort of DNA, this DNA of getting things done. So in listening to some of the previous speakers and looking and absorbing what I think makes societies tick at a very fundamental level, this is one of my favorite quotes. You know, it's usually those people who everyone thinks are crazy, who everyone feels don't know what they're talking about, like the lady who was just on stage, that end up making the difference. It's not those who sort of go with the flow. And I think every one of us in this room has that ability. The thing is, we don't yet know it. So this quote was brought to many people's attention in an Apple ad in the early 80s. And it resonates, I think, with me endlessly, and I'm sure it will resonate with most of you, because Almost every speaker I've listened to has done that crazy thing. And I mean good crazy. These are some of the names of the people who were at that event. And from what you can see, they ran the gamut from history to economics to science to whatever you call it. And this is what I think you need in any society that wants to be a problem-solving society. The people who map it, the people who ideate, the makers themselves, which is something I have an interest in, the people who amplify what needs to be done, the bridgers and the storytellers. Who are these individuals? People who make from that things like this. People who take trash and turn it into that. This is a young man from Kenya, Cyrus Kabiru, whose work is on show in New York as we speak. People who take syringes that were discarded and create toys that can be used as excavators. This was at Maker Faire Africa in 2000 last year, actually. So I would think, speaking about makers, that they inhabit a short mental distance of what is needed and what is possible. They are people such as the ones assembled here, whether they went to the best Ivy League schools or from the corner of the road, who sit down and get things done. They're the individuals who, like the people here who established a space in Togo, who said, well, we can talk about design and architecture and manufacturing and everything else, but what are we actually doing? This isn't about, it's about value add, but it's doing the value add. Because all I'm here to talk about really is the doing. Because if you have the doing, the chairs you sit on, the screens you're looking at, the mics and everything else, we begin to make them. And in aggregate, they begin to sort of build themselves. So one of my more recent interests is to move from the fairs that take place in an African country every year to more permanent spaces, where people can sort of build their way through what they need to do. And by doing that, and this is what we've seen in Europe, in the United States and elsewhere, is that when you have people tinkering, those tinkerers are eventually the ones who manufacture and prototype. And when they prototype, they end up being the ones who also create jobs. On this continuum, some of us are here, some of us are there, but if we want to get there, we need to ask ourselves what is needed and what is possible. And we need to apply value to all of those who are working in that continuum. To sort of begin the summation of what I was referring to earlier, we need to reinforce these ideas of creativity, repeat them, reinforce them by bringing together like minds, people who need a refuge from the activities that pull them down, and reinforce what they're doing that's great. We need to do it at all scales. This isn't about the national level or the regional level or whatever level. We need to do it at scales where the young man that you run into on the street that might be selling oranges has an idea. That idea needs to be built up. And what we find is when we bring all these kinds of individuals together, as we found not just at TED, but in other things I've been involved with, something begins to happen on its own. And it begins to sort of self-heal and sort of build itself up. So these are fractal images. Africa has its fractals that sort of build these communities that create, solve problems, and move where we want it to go. And my sense is that it's already started. It started in rooms like this. It started in Arusha, as I'm sure some of you would testify. And my hope is that we see it sort of morphing in a lot of different areas, a lot of different industries, so that maybe if we come back 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the conversation we'll be having is that young man, by the way, the one who built the excavator out of the syringes, he lives in a one-room apartment with his parents, one-room apartment with his parents in Enugu. And he was able to create something that I haven't seen some engineers do with their fancy degrees. So my point is, we may come back 5 or 6 years from now, 10 years from now, and if we give that kind of individual, the kind of nourishment that they deserve, will be surprised at what they build. We've seen it happen. One of the people who was at the Arusha event can speak to that. He's speaking after me. There was a young man by the name of William Kamkwamba who built a windmill out of scrap, literally, and solved the problem because there was a need for it. And he didn't sit around asking questions about why it couldn't be solved. So the question I'll throw to the audience is, are you part of a problem-solving society? Have you found it within yourself to look at the problems you can solve? I'm sure many of you are. Sometimes we think it's not for us. But every society that sort of moves from a level of being one that consumes to one that produces to one that becomes wealthy and rich takes a path that is somewhat similar to that. So that's all I have to say. I'm really pleased to be here. I remember the first conversation I had with, I think it was Chikwe, about what happens after Arusha. And one of the things I said is that we're planting seeds. And I can't testify to it, but I'm sure some of you do. I think those seeds are beginning to blossom. And I'd love to see many more of them. So that's all I have to say. And surprisingly, I have 7 minutes, but I'm done. So thanks again.